Welcome back to Pop Politics. I am Damien Lewarden.
I am Mitchell Ackhurst.
Together we are Third Take, and today we've been inspired by a Twitter post from that we saw last week. So we're going to be talking about the value of entertainment, the role of PR, and a few other things. So, Mitch, I wanted to start off by asking you, what is the last time that you played a game for 500 hours?
Unless that game is the game of life. It's just something that honestly I hear people talking about. Oh, I put 1,000 hours into this or that, and it terrifies me. I I I appreciate, I admire the ability of people to focus for that long on something that they love, but especially when it comes to video games, I can't see myself putting 500 hours into a game.
Yeah. So what is the longest, or just off the top of your head, what is the longest that you think you have put into any single game?
It's a bit of a toss up. I had a thought that there were two big ones I remember from when I finished high school, and I had a little time on my hands, and I could just. There were days where I just played them straight through, and they were both over 50-hour RPGs, and that was Final Fantasy 13, Dragon Age Origins. Uh, I I look back on that time with amazement. it's it's something that I could never do now. I think that the modern world has destroyed my attention span, and we're just you get busy. You've got IRL things to worry about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm in a very similar sort of situation with like, especially like when I see, because we're talking here about, so last weekend the Dying Light Twitter account put out a post being like, oh, our game will take you 500 hours to complete. And they later sort of, they didn't really backtrack, but they clarified, and we'll come back to that later on. But yeah, I think I'm in a similar boat to you where it's like I see a game that's going to take, or that claims to take 500 hours, and it's just like, yeah, no, I think I've got better things to do with my time than that.
Absolutely.
And like, I think that's actually a part of what they were trying to tap into with that. But again, we'll come back to that, sorry. In terms of games that I've probably spent the longest on, yeah, I think I'm probably in this, again, a similar situation to you, that I haven't spent that long in any games recently. But definitely back when I was in high school and just after high school is when um, the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion came out. And I
Mm.
think I spent probably in that a total of about 120 hours-ish over three separate playthroughs. And each time I found myself just getting exhausted by the end of it, even back then.
Mm.
Yeah, I just think that there's just too much, you know?
Yeah, it's tricky to think about because those are games that are designed specifically to prey on your ability to choose. You know, do you want to move on and do something, anything else, or are you so excited to be in this one game that you spend 120 hours? But I feel exactly the same as you. If I spend 120 hours in any one game, I start to feel anxious. I start to realize, there's not as much in there as I thought I was getting out of it. And ultimately, it's a personality thing. Some people will apply themselves to one game professionally. There'll be professional speedrunners. They play thousands of hours of games, don't they? And that's pretty cool because they've figured out a way to make the game novel for themselves again and again by trying to break it. And then there are other people who probably play even less games than we do, but the one game they play is where they put all their time in.
Yeah, and just bringing up that last point that you mentioned just then, um, and even going back to what we said earlier about like being in high school or out of high school, I think one of the big things with those sorts of situations is that people, they may have the time on their hands, but they don't necessarily have the money to go out and buy, a whole bunch of different games that are maybe 10, 20 hours long, and then they're just going to drop it. So like, what do you see as I guess like the value of entertainment in terms of like the dollar value? Like what's sort of the trade-off? Where do you sit in that?
Where I sit,
Yeah.
well, I think I was in a conversation on Discord earlier in the week where we were trying to figure out how does the balance of your entertainment sort of fit into your life. You know, if you were to make percentages, how much is TV, how much is reading, how much is games or movies? And I watch, on a good week, I'll watch 2 or 3 hours of television because I'll go to a friend's place on Friday nights and we'll try and catch up with whichever shows we're interested in. And that's the most I spend on out of all the different kinds of entertainment that I spend my free time on. It's television, and it's still, you know, on a good week 3 hours. And right behind that is comic books, where if I've got time on the weekend, maybe I'll spend a couple hours reading a comic book. And beyond that, video games mean a lot to me, and I will play them whenever I get the chance. But they're so much further down because of their investment. And I think investment kind of has a lot to do with this, because if you're not trying to keep up with TV shows that your friends are watching, and you're not so interested in comic books that you want to read what's the new, you know, the latest interesting fantasy series from a popular writer is, that sort of thing, then you don't have that anxiety I'm sure both of us share, that you want to keep up with what's coming out so you can have an up-to-date opinion about the state of this or that. Some people don't have that at all, and they will just play what they like over and over. A friend of mine just plays Monster Hunter, and to him the value of that one game must be infinite, which is great, but that's not the case for me. I mean, last time I was on, we talked about Returnal, which is a very long, very difficult game, very fun to get stuck into for a long time. And even that, you know, I took a months long break between the first half and the second half of the game because I just couldn't handle being absorbed in this one repetitive pattern of thought for so long. And I don't know if that's the same as with you, because I think both, as we both have looked at news cycles, and we've both been interested in publishing of various kinds, we're a little flighty, and so we like to keep moving our eyes about. We like to keep our eye on what's coming out next, and I think that creates a little bit of anxiety if you get too deep into one thing, especially one thing that's not recent.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Like I'm not as time's gone on, I've gotten less and less interested in keeping up with what's in the zeitgeist, what's trending at the moment. I find it exhausting
Mm-hmm.
to keep up with
Mm-hmm.
that. But that doesn't mean because I do book reviews for Aurealis magazine and I do quite a bit of writing for Escapist. It's like I still feel like I need to be up on what's happening. So it's this really tough um, finding of the balance between like doing just stuffing around in whatever games or whatever TV shows that I want to watch, and then also keeping up with the things that I have to for my work. So yeah, I just find it really, I just find it not difficult, but I find it, yeah, I think you're right when you say anxiety inducing to be in that position where it's like I just want to do what I want.
And we both find ourselves in that position where, honestly, if we did both do what we wanted, we'd be even poorer than we currently are. You know, if I spent all the
Absolutely.
time I had on the things that excite me, I'd probably end up watching a lot more movies, which I would love. But you know, they're a 3 hour commitment most of the time,
Mm.
and I wouldn't get any job applications sent. I wouldn't have a social life. I wouldn't do this or that. I'd probably be happy with it, but it wouldn't get me anywhere.
Mm, yeah. I guess I'm kind of lucky in that I don't really have much of a social life, so I still get to do quite a lot of like the stuff I just want to do. But so you said that you watch maybe 2 or 3 hours of TV a week, just using that as like your barometer, sort of. Not have you seen that changing, but like how do you reflect on that in terms of prestige TV? Like what you might once have like sat back and waited for it to come onto TV versus now streaming where you pay a pretty low amount and you have endless amounts of content for you to choose from.
I think that is a perfect example of how some of us have a personality that is happy with what's out there, and some of us have a personality that keeps us on our toes, always looking for the next thing that's going to be important. Because like you say, for a relatively low sum, I mean, it's getting up there in Australia because there's so many channels that are sort of splintered out that you could argue it's like coming up on that month's worth of groceries problem. If you if
Mm,
you if you didn't pay for any of them, then that's probably quite a bit additional. But even if you just pay for one, like Netflix, there's never going to be a day where you can't watch something. However, why? That's my question. And I think that's the 3 hours of television I watch. Is I will go while we're not locked down. I will go to a friend's place and we will watch these three specific shows that we've been enjoying and talk about them. And that's sort of part of my social network, is just being able to hang out with those guys for an evening and chat about what they like. I mean, I'm not the hugest fan of the Marvel TV series, but I will watch those because it's something to keep up with, and the other two guys are huge Marvel fans. So that's a great reason for me. But I myself have no pressure or interest in watching them unless they're worth talking about, and that's mostly determined by who I'm writing for. So,
yeah.
so yeah, it's tricky because I think when you're in this position of wanting to critique or at least be a pundit for a specific industry, you don't view it the same way as you do just anyone else whose job is unrelated and it's pure escapism to them to watch television in the evening. To
Good.
circle back around to the meaning of having so many hours of entertainment at your fingertips, I think you have to figure out what it means for you personally.
Yeah. But I actually wanted to pick up on sort of your tangent there because I think it was a good point in terms of so you watch these television shows so that you have an opportunity to talk about them. Like that's your main draw
Yep,
for watching them,
I
right?
don't even.
Did I understand? Yeah.
I mean, I'll do my best if I have a spare day, but it's tricky right now because it's the holidays, so I'm trying to keep up with my family, and they're out of town, but we can travel right now, thankfully. So I won't sort of catch up on these shows if I miss them. I haven't seen the ending of Hawkeye yet, and I'm way behind on Star Wars because if I don't see it on the Friday night with my mates, it's not really worth it.
Mm. Yeah. I don't really talk about shows that much with the people around me. Like I do with my partner, because most of the time we'll sit
You'll be
down and
watching
watch the
them.
shows together. Yeah, so like she'll pick one, and then I'll pick one, and she picks a lot of Korean dramas, right? So it's
Good
quite fun.
shows.
They are. Um, but yeah, so we'll talk. But then outside of just us, I don't really talk about it that much with other people unless I'm doing like a write up on something for whatever. Um, but I wanted to ask, like, beyond that conversation, do you think there is like any sort of inherent, I don't know, like moral or intellectual value to the entertainment we consume, or and it, like I guess are there sort of tiers between the different forms of entertainment?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because this, I think, ties directly to the Dying Light tweet, which is that I don't find the recent spate of book adaptations, whether you're talking The Wheel of Time or The Witcher, and I was talking to a friend about it, and he mentioned, oh, it's not too surprising. Lots of books are getting television series because those kinds of stories don't get movies right now. They're all superheroes, so instead they're being turned to television. But rather than your 2 hour movie, or as I was extolling the virtues of Once Upon a Time, your 3 or 4 hour miniseries, which I thought was a great way to turn a book into a television show because the majority of mainstream lit can be broken down into 2 acts. Like that's just the way that a good story along those lines that isn't 1,000 pages long can be presented. If you break it in half, that's a pretty good adaptation. You've got a good 2 night miniseries. Now they're all 7 or 8 hour long, like full seasons of television, and from an edification perspective, from just enjoying visual art, from enjoying storytelling, I think it's stretched out and kind of hostile. and that goes for some of the non-adaptations as well. So it's not just when you're turning a book into television, but when you're stretching a concept like WandaVision or the Falcon and the Winter Soldier over the course of at least 6 episodes, sometimes 8. There's there's a little bit of hostility there. It's built for the churn rather than for a specific sort of entertainment moment where, as you say, like it has some sort of intrinsic moral value or just a cool idea. Like there are episodes of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier that have 10 minutes of really cool, like kinetic visual storytelling, and then the rest of it is not particularly valuable unless you want to know the ins and outs of how the wheels spin in the Marvel universe. And so for some people that's also worthwhile, but I wouldn't call it artistically interesting.
Yeah, I know for my part at least, like I have minimal interest in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I haven't watched any of the shows. I think it was like the start of last year. My partner and I we sat down, we watched all of the movies that had been released to that point. And I mean, I think that's probably a mistake because by the end of it, again, the exhaustion of it set in. Because it was what like 22, 23 movies at that point, and now there's even more. Like we watched Spider-Man, but yeah, um,
Literal
I don't.
days of movies, literal
Well, we
days of sitting through movies, but the actual content of interest is a pretty low percentage.
yeah, I don't really like to keep up that much with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and even like a lot of like the blockbusters that come out, even though most of them are, I guess, superhero movies now. It's kind of scary. Anyway, um, but I liked what you brought up before about the whole adaptation
Hmm.
angle because we're currently watching Station 11, and I think I'm finding it really interesting so far. We're 4 episodes in, um, and I think they've actually done it really well because each episode tells a completely sort of self-contained story to some degree, and the way it jumps through time. So it's very clearly it doesn't have that vibe that you're talking about where it feels necessarily like it's been stretched out too far. I think it may get like that before the end, but right now it's just like very tight, very effective building as it goes on. And if I'm being honest, I agree with you in that you don't really see that very often,
Mm.
particularly from adaptations, where it's like you just sit there and it's just like that.
So it
Do you
depends
think?
what you're in there for. It depends.
Yeah,
It depends because if I viewed, let's see, what's a good example of? There's a show called The Nevers, also on HBO Max, I think, which
I
is
don't know it.
which is unfortunately a Joss Whedon project. He has now left, as you may expect. That series didn't even get properly finished because of the pandemic, but they were able to finish 6 episodes, and
Hmm.
and it's quite a lot like what you're describing. It's good. I mean, I think it is HBO brand. Yes, it's HBO brand. So they're doing the tits and gore as you would expect from HBO, but in terms of presentation, it's also got that HBO sheen, which also extends to the storytelling and the fact that each episode, kind of like what you're saying with Station 11, has its own concerns. They're all over an hour long, I think, so they're all sort of their own movie that builds into the greater story that the season is telling. And what I was getting at with that show compared to, say, what I felt with maybe half of The Witcher season one is it feels like it's always on. You never come to a point where the show feels like it's spinning its wheels. And if you were to compare that to Mayor of Easttown, which I saw a couple episodes of, but obviously was watching it with the friends, and then they had to finish it when the lockdown started, so I never finished it. But I saw the first couple episodes, and if I was watching that through the lens of someone who wanted The Nevers, which is a fantasy show, I would be bored because I'd be waiting for the part of the show where it kicks off, and it's a murder mystery, so it does technically have a kickoff point at the end of episode one when the murder in question happens. But even after that, broadly the show is about the relationships in the town, and if you wanted really complicated plots or cool twists every 10 minutes or so, like you do with something more adventurous, something more fantastical, you would probably think that it was dragging because it wasn't what
Mm.
you're interested in. And I think about that a lot because there are people who play video games that have very little narrative content, but they're not in it for the narrative. And there are other cycles like your Destinies and Warframes. There are other cycles of content in terms of missions and the way the gunplay works and meeting up with friends and going on dungeon raids and things that for them are just as interesting as I guess what interests us when we're talking about narrative, like a narrative arc or a 20-minute episode of TV or something.
Mm. Yeah, and I guess that comes back to that whole value discussion we
Hmm.
were having. It's like, what do you find the value in within entertainment? Is it the inherent, like the inherent pleasure of watching something? Is it the inherent pleasure of play? Because I know for me, that's not that's not what I'm in it for. I don't know, like it doesn't sound like you're in it for that either, necessarily.
Yeah, well, there's a good reason why those two examples I brought up were both pretty heavy, pretty story-heavy RPGs. I mean, I wouldn't call Final Fantasy 13 an excellent story by any means,
No.
but it's certainly if I were to spend 50 hours playing a game, it makes a lot of sense because I'd say that game is probably 25 hours of cutscenes. So
Mm,
that accounts for a large chunk of length of time spent. And Dragon Age Origins is similar. I mean, it's much more interactive and you can pick your dialogue and that sort of thing, but it's got a huge story component. And
yeah.
and when we talk about what draws us to books, movies, games, television, it's hard to remember sometimes that the promise of a great yarn is actually really hard to advertise, and often people advertising television don't even care to try.
Mm.
They'll instead advertise it based on, as you say, the inherent enjoyment of just watching something play out in front of you.
I think it comes back to like one of the key differences between the mediums as well, because like in a book, it's like you sort of expect that you're going to get, as you say, a good yarn. Usually, not always. Not always,
Well,
but like,
we've both been at various times plugged into the spec fiction community of Australia, and yes,
mm,
it's true that you'll sometimes pick up a book and realize it's one of those ones where the person wakes up in the morning and looks out the window, and then something sci-fi happens and they go to bed.
yeah, yeah. But I guess where I was going with it was like there's sort of that expectation that you're there for a good story, but that's not necessarily an inherent part of television because it is a visual medium. So you expect to get like that visual pleasure, that voyeurism element. So that's what's sort of focused on in the advertising to some degree. And again, it comes the same with games because it's Days Gone's been in the news again recently, and I played it, I think,
Hmm.
close to the end of last year. Um, and you know what? It actually had a quite a good story. Like, but that wasn't a focus of the advertising. The focus of the advertising was it's an interactive medium. Look at this guy running away from all these thousands and thousands of zombies, right? And so yeah, it's just like that different advertising of the different media, and then how that manifests in the actual experience of experiencing it.
Experience, yeah, and I guess to try and I don't know, keep myself from going on off on too many more tangents about what what we like to get out of these things, and like you say, whether it has some kind of intrinsic value to us morally or artistically, or if it's fine for it to just be something, like often I think about when I go to the gallery. Not that I go to the gallery often, but I think often about when I've been to the gallery and how sometimes there are paintings that you walk past. You're like, oh, that's interesting. Keep going. It doesn't mean that there was any less work put into them, but they're just not as interesting to you. And so subjectivity has something to say here. But also, like, some of these things are made just to be looked at and moved on from. A lot of television, obviously, we could talk about maybe the least of all these categories, your lifestyle television, and the kinds of ads that they have on lifestyle channels aren't all that different from the programs
Mm,
because you're getting maybe 20% at a stretch of like interesting content, and the rest of it is repeating lines, repeating shots. It's like they don't have any pressure to do better, because if you want to watch a show about people looking for houses, this is the only option you've
mm,
got. They don't have to give you 25 minutes of excellent television. They just have to give you something that portrays your interest, whether that is, a pawn shop, or if it's house hunters where they're looking for a new place to live. Like, there's nowhere else you're going to get that, so they don't have any pressure to make it, I suppose, what we would say, to have better value.
mm. I think.
um
Sorry. No, you go.
yeah, you
Okay,
go.
I'll go. Because I was just going to pick up there. It's like there is, I guess, a little bit of pressure because like there are multiple of those shows. But I guess like for the audience looking for those shows, it's like they're still going to consume all of them because that's what
Absolutely.
they want, right?
Yeah, and when we talk about very long video games, which is the subject to begin with, it's the same thing, because there's nothing wrong with people wanting to watch lifestyle programs. That I can totally understand why you would watch lifestyle programs, because those subjects are really intricate and interesting. But when I see what they have to do to these shows to make it last 24 hours, 7 days a week, and keep pumping out enough content to make an entire channel worthwhile, they'll repeat every episode once a day. So it's more like 12 hours of content, and then they'll just repeat that during the night. But when I see that, I think that's not exactly value. Even if you were to take all of these shows, as you say, they do compete a little because there are different shows made by different groups. But if you take all of them and you were to say, like, look at this 500 hours of value, I would think that that's not really what anyone wants. If you were trying to sell 500 hours of these programs to an individual rather than a television company, you would want to sell it based on how good the programs are. Because as far as I'm aware, they don't sell House Hunters DVDs in JB Hi-Fi. They sell you DVDs of the programs that are more expensive, like your Ice Road Truckers, or the one that's set in Alaska with the crab fishing, you know,
Not Dangerous Catch.
Deadliest Catch.
Deadliest Catch.
Yeah, and those are shows that actually make a case for their value. Those are the shows where you're not buying it because it's 500 hours of crab catching. You're buying it because they actually make a case for why you'd want to watch it. They're a bit more expensive. They've got actual like stories about the people who work on these trucks or on these ships, and that's a matter of degrees. I mean, they're both shown on these channels. Those kinds of programs are shown on all these channels, but I think there's a big difference there between me saying, would you like 500 hours of Ice Road Truckers or Deadliest Catch, or would you like 500 hours of House Hunters? Because once you've seen a couple episodes of a program that's stretched that thinly, you'll want to see something else. I don't think you could make it through 500 hours straight of the cheaper ones of these.
And I don't think it's necessarily only the cheap bit that you're talking about. It's also, like you mentioned, the stories, but I think it's also like the visual action of something like Deadliest Catch, something like Ice Road Truckers. It's like there's like that hook, there's that feature in that of just like seeing the situations that is that is kind of compelling, that you don't get from people just walking around houses being like, oh yes, I like to sink.
Yeah, and
Don't know.
And it's interesting that you bring that up, because the cheapness isn't necessarily just how much money they spend. Sometimes it's when we talk about production value, and production value is one of those things that's actually very funny, because if you point your camera at a family having a picnic in a field, that's one level of production value, and then if you turn it to the rodeo happening next door, the production value's gone up because you're suddenly recording something that's exciting. And that's why houses are good for these shows, because there is a certain level of production value to showing a really good or really bad house. And I think in video games we're starting to see that as well, with games especially like Destiny, where they will get production value out of the fact that Bungie knows how to make really pretty planets. I'm sure that they budget pretty highly for the visuals of like a skybox, or just coming up with interesting designs for particular levels, because if it's that interesting to begin with and you can get people coming back, then you're pretty much covered for visual engagement. And that's your Ice Road Truckers or something, where like it's already set in an interesting place. Now you need to make the action happen.
I think like that whole idea of like very pretty pictures as like a base for something more is something we need to come back to at some point on this show, but we're running a little low on time, so I want to sort of transition over to our next topic, getting back to the original tweet. I can't remember what it actually said. It was something like, if you want to see everything that is in Dying Light 2, it'll take you 500 hours, which
Mm.
is not that much less time than it would take you to walk from Warsaw to Madrid. Um,
It's a sobering aspect that they picked Warsaw to Madrid, isn't it? Like crossing
yeah.
Europe is an incredibly dangerous and difficult thing for some people.
I mean, it's an absolute pleasure. I didn't go to Warsaw or Madrid, but like traveling in Europe was a pleasure. We were in a van, we weren't walking. Um, but anyway, so the way I see it, and like as I said, they later came back and clarified, oh, it'll take most players between 70 and 80 hours to get through the main story and then a few of the side quests. And then they came back again later and went, oh, well, the actual main story is only 20 hours if that's all you want. Um, but I think as a PR exercise, they knew exactly what they were doing because the point of PR is to get basically free coverage. That's why you do marketing, to get people to see your product without paying for it. And they knew what they were doing because obviously this was put on Twitter. Any PR people on Twitter know the gaming Twitter discourses. They're cyclical and they're exhausting. And I mean, one of them is that, oh, games are too long, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, um, and like they knew when they put it out that a whole bunch of gaming journalists would see that and just sigh and be like, fuck off, guys, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they knew that they would then go on and write about that and talk about that because guess what? Here we are talking about it, right?
Absolutely. It's one of those things that I get particularly on tilt. Thankfully, not on Twitter. I tend to avoid getting tilted on Twitter. I will tend to wait a bit before I tweet about it. But when I saw it, I was like, there are already people defending the 500 hours as if that was the point of the ad, rather than, as you say, getting eyes on Dying Light 2, which, having done a bit of marketing, I can completely understand that. I think good for whoever came up with that idea because they probably got a raise. Uh, but it's part of a pattern from those developers for Dead Island and Dying Light 1 that they have a slightly, let's say, right of center approach to their political PR. They love to. This is trickier not being an American because
Mm,
America, the United States of America, the people in that country are such an enormous chunk of the audience for these video games that they tend to target people in America with their ads. But
mm,
when European devs approach something that has a political dog whistly aspect to it, like bringing up that games are too long, and then you've got a whole bunch of these reactionaries who think of critics who complain about games being too long as like elites, being like coastal liberals and all that sort of thing. When you start advertising to take advantage of that, you can kind of get real off center. You're trying to hit that bullseye of, I'm going to get a lot of discussion. I'm going to get people on such and such side complaining about it. I'm going to get people on this side defending it. And instead, you hit a slightly gross level of, um, well, if you're talking about whether games are very long or too long, even, forget that because we're the longest. And
mm.
and there are people who are going to use that as yet another example in their own arguments of why developers should listen to a specific section of the player base, and that specific section is the vocal, angry minority on Twitter who say that they want their games to all be over 100 hours long, and they don't want this and they don't want that. It's difficult to talk about without properly unpacking it, but
Mm.
as you say, they knew what they were doing. And when you see that ad, you're like, oh, okay, I can see where this is coming from as a point of view. And when people are already defending that without realizing what's underneath, all they're saying is, oh, I think that's great that it's 500 hours. I have no problem with games being long. If you don't like that, just play something else. It's very surface level, and it's not addressing the fact that there is a pattern of this slightly dog whistly, Twitter baity advertising from these people, and it doesn't make anyone feel better.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and like I like how you unpack that just then, in terms of like looking at like the political sort of alignment of that advertising, because I didn't think of it in that angle. The way I thought of it was that it just felt so cynical. It just felt like they knew that, people would react to it. And like I feel as if that is a really troublesome thing, like from a holistic perspective, because I feel as if we see it quite a lot. Like, even like the really cutesy sort of brand accounts engage with their audiences through like this lens of humor. I still find that so cynical
Yeah,
because, like,
absolutely.
it's,
The
yeah,
cynicism, I don't want to minimize that by talking about it in terms of having this weird American political bent, because the cynicism is 100% the more important side. I suppose I was saying, like, you could come at this from a different angle and talk about the wholesome games argument,
mm,
which I'd say is approaching the same level of cynicism, but from the opposite political direction, which is that the the wholesome games wave comes with a lot of scolding of people who like things to be a little bit more realistic, or you might say a little bit more dirty, a little bit more tinged with reality. There's This has already happened in publishing with books, 5 years ago, but with video games, it sort of really exploded last year, where people were talking about games that have nothing but good vibes, and everyone is fishing or whatever. It's like here's this cute little game set in a cute little town where everyone is a bean and they smile, and that's inherently better than these nasty, violent video games. And that that also is a bit of a dog whistle, because when you hear wholesome games, you should think, oh, that's fun. Like, these are games that aren't trying to be sarcastic or violent. It's just very nice and cute, and I love Animal Crossing, that sort of thing. But it quickly became that when people bring up wholesome games, there was this other undercurrent uh, of genre scolding, of being like, well, we're trying to avoid all that nasty business with violent video games.
yeah. And I just find it interesting that you bring that, just what you said there about how, everything's nice and everyone's a bean or whatever, because like I haven't played Unpacking yet, but it's one of those things that like it's relatable, and like the whole idea of sort of like shifting your life is something that's, I think there's like something that's really intelligent in that, like something that's really emotional, that I think speaks to the core of who we are as people more than, oh, look, another war game.
Absolutely.
Um,
Um, but you picked a game from a developer that's well known for being quite straightforward and a very, I don't know, like, they're not cynical. Like, the Witchbeam guys are not. They're not trying to sell you on some kind of wholesome fantasy. They're telling you what this game, like, most of the advertising of that game was, look at what this game is. and when people picked it
Yeah.
up, they liked it because it was what they were selling.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and that's kind of the opposite of this dying light talk. It's like, well, you're telling me it takes 500 hours to do everything. What about that should excite me? Is
Mm.
it because the 500 hours is like 500 hours of a really good post-apocalyptic TV show? Are you telling me that this is sort of like 500 hours of the best of The Walking Dead? You know, because I
If
guess that's
only.
exciting. Or are you
Yeah.
saying that 250 of those 500 hours will be sort of walking slowly from place to place because you don't want to attract monsters?
And like how much of it's gonna be collecting random flags and shit, picking up, yeah, whatever. Um, anyway, I think we got a bit diverted there. We don't have enough time to really talk about this topic as much as I would have liked. But I wanted to talk about the way that PR manifests in the world, spawning out from what you mentioned before about how it's taps into like that those political arguments we sort of have, that political divide, because I want to talk about what I'm calling PR politics, which is this wave we see where politicians care more about their image and the image they project than what they actually do,
Mm-hmm.
because it's something that I've noticed really very much here in Australia with Scott Morrison, and I'm not the only one. He's got the hashtag Scotty from marketing for a reason, but it was something that we also saw with Donald Trump as well.
Absolutely.
He would just go on and just say whatever he thought people wanted to hear.
Yeah, I think again, I'm not plugged into American politics enough.
No, nor am I.
But when you bring up ScoMo, Scott Morrison, it's just an example of something going on in Australia that I think is pretty analogous to the 500 hours of gameplay thing, which is, oh, we're going to introduce something we're calling religious freedom, and
Mm,
you're like, oh, religious freedom, that could mean a lot of different things. Does it mean the thing that I want? Because that's great. Okay, religious freedom. Oh, no, it doesn't mean that. What you mean by religious freedom is kind of the opposite. I don't want 500 hours of collecting flags. So all of a sudden, when you've advertised to me that this particular thing is exciting because it's got a great name, whether you're saying you can play this game forever or we're going to introduce religious freedom, what you're actually saying is sort of a level or two beneath. It's like, well, actually, we're calling it this, but really it's for this group of people over here who are going to get really angry if we don't talk about it. Just like the people who love long video games and hate it whenever a new game comes out and isn't long enough. That vocal minority that the Liberal Party is all too happy to sort of switch between talking about video games and advertising and PR and politics. The Liberal Party is all too happy to appeal to the vocal minority because in Australia, the vocal minority is also the people with the money.
mm. I just find that like the whole rhetoric around that, um, like it's very patriarchal. It's very sort of like, oh, I'm going to say what I think, and I'm going to project that on everyone because they're all silent. So, they're not going to speak up and disagree with me because I say that it's what they want.
Yeah, it's Australia is tricky like that because we've never had the most revolutionary mainstream. But I think
Mm,
right now we're in a position where everyone is so tired of everything that it's like we're a country in Eastern Europe that's been taken over 50 times. We just go, okay, fine. The government has decided once again to do this terrible slash very dumb thing, and there's nothing we can do about it because you know even putting aside the two party politics idea and saying, well, it doesn't matter who you vote for, even putting that aside, like the Liberal Party will always reverse whatever progress we've had in the last time we had some other kind of government. Um, it doesn't really matter who's there, so why should we care? And
Mm,
therefore, your silent majority becomes this weakly oppressed people who just like, oh, as long as I can get to the end of the day without being, assaulted or something. Which, by the way, still happens. Where we should be a country that doesn't have people sleeping on the streets. We should be a country that doesn't have people being assaulted by police officers, and yet we are.
yeah. I guess,
Sorry, I
and
didn't mean to depress you.
no, 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 you didn't. I'm just trying to get back to where I sort of was in the middle of where you were. Because the last thing that I want to bring up was something that came up just a couple of days ago, actually. It was in the media that the government was talking about pushing people who are like elderly Australians and people who are on job seeker into the job that have now been sort of lost because everyone's out because of COVID. So I've got massive supply chain issues, blah, 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 that
Yeah.
somehow weren't foreseen.
Hmm.
Don't ask me how that happened. But so, and I mean, the whole job seeker thing is something that I'm really passionate about because I was on job seeker for a year. And like I hear people talk about, oh, they're lazy, oh, they're blah, blah, blah. And I just get so
Oh,
pissed off with it. It's not that easy. It's like, sure, anyone can go down and get a casual job, but like, a casual job to me, I've done casual jobs, and the worst experience of it was I went weeks without work, and then my boss rostered me on for a single 3 hour shift at 5 in the morning. And I'm like, that's not fucking sustainable for anyone. Sure, some people can do that. That's fine. Me, not me. I don't want that kind of job. And I don't think I'm alone in that. People want job security, no matter what the government, no matter what the media wants to tell us about how, oh, we're living in the gig economy, we're living in blah, blah, blah.
mm, absolutely. Job security is one of those things. I guess it's a bit like unions. you know, it's something that unless someone is particularly aligned politically, you almost can't even bring it up because their brain is all top down, as you say, with the media telling them what to think. It's all just like, why should I care about X, or why should I do anything about Y? And it's like, well, maybe because we're all down here and we're supposed to be the majority with the power. The whole point of democracy is that the power derives from the people rather than the other way around. If we're all down here, we should be able to help ourselves out, including things like job security, but we're so brainwashed by, I guess, the kinds of narratives that people don't enjoy, but they hear all the time from advertising about like the minority with the money and the minority with the jobs, that sort of thing.
Um, yeah, absolutely. But I guess sort of I went on a bit of a tangent there and I wasn't meant to. But because my point was, it was bandied about in the media, and it's like that is very clearly another PR exercise. It is a way for them to again vilify the unemployed because, oh, look,
Look how
we want
rowdy and grumpy they are.
yeah, and we want the unemployed to step into these positions that they don't necessarily have the training for, that it will take them weeks to get training for, but because they're not there to fill those roles immediately, we can blame them.
Hmm.
And then we can use that later to be like, oh, we don't need to do anything for them because they don't want to do anything for themselves. Goes back to the whole Aesop's fable, God helps those who help themselves. So it just builds on the ideology
Hmm.
around the conservative liberal national party values that they enforce within Australia while they're in government.
Yeah, I mean,
uh,
how can we expect for the broad sentiment, especially driven by the media, to care about people who don't even have houses to live in if we can't go so far as the people who don't have jobs, but maybe they have a house to live in at least?
mm,
It's sort of like, I don't think there's any turning that
no,
discussion. And PR politics, it's like Coca-Cola. They don't have to try hard, but as long as they keep pushing it out, they'll stay on top. How that relates to, I don't know, media and selling people video games, it's all connected in very, Marxist kind of ways that I don't need to go into. But
Yeah.
but it's certainly interesting that it comes as a good microcosm, because it's like those dirty, elitist snobs, that minority who's asking for quality of X, whether that's quality of life or quality of video games, they don't want you to have these 500-hour games. They don't want you to have a good job, because that's the other thing, right? Is they'll frame it as, oh, they want to take your jobs, and
Mm.
therefore your job will be worse because the unemployed, the scary blob of the unemployed, is going to come in and sort of suck the life out of these beautiful companies you work for. So the this disgusting minority of people who have some kind of problem that is rightfully making them irritated, they don't want you to have X, Y, or Z. And that's it. It's easy. That's as easy as that, because what's more compelling than telling someone, like, oh, we have what you really want, which in this case is, I don't know, endless video games. In both cases, perhaps, because if you've got a job that pays you a lot to do not very much, you can probably play lots of video games on the side.
Yeah, what you're talking about there, a lot of it goes back to the whole us versus them thing, which we just see constantly
Mm-hmm.
over and over again everywhere, especially in politics. Um,
I'm going to
and
turn you into them instead of being us, simply by highlighting the fact that you spoke out. You spoke out. It makes you critical. It makes you unruly, and I can always fall back to on the liberal elite thing. It's like, oh, maybe you don't have a job, and maybe you're having trouble even having housing security, but you're a liberal elite because you've been to university and you can describe these things in a way that makes a little more academic sense than if you were just angry and throwing things.
but also because you can talk about it, we don't want to hear from you because you're an elite. Work that out. Um, anyway, so I guess we're kind of not ending on the note I kind of wanted to, which was a bit more upbeat, a bit happier, but
Oh dear.
it happens.
it's
um,
it is tough when there's no easy way out of this. There's no
no,
outside of these problems.
it's like they are everything. They make up the very fabric of our society. I'm sure someone can put a positive spin on it. I'm not that person.
We should probably address this again in a couple of
Oh
weeks.
yeah,
It'd be great. It'd be great to sort of redux and see if, I don't know, if anything we've said in the meantime has made us think about solutions, or just worse examples.
yeah. Well, yeah, because next episode I want to talk about national identity and
Mm.
nationalism and patriotism and all of that. So hopefully
Well,
you'll be along for that.
can't wait to put my foot in my mouth with all of that.
It'll be fine. It'll be fun. Yeah, so thank you so much. Is there anything else that you want to say to cap off?
Don't vote with your wallet, because that's kind of silly. Uh, as much as it can be fun. If you're interested in very ridiculous things I have to say occasionally, mostly about writing, you can follow me on Twitter at Polygon Native. No spaces, no underscores. And until next time, think about how even the smallest thing you do will annoy someone that we've been talking about. Think about just being a better person, and spreading the love, and all the ways that you can just be the kind of irritating liberal elite that's going to change people's minds in this country and around the world.
Nice way to end it. Thank you so much, Mitch. Thank you so much for everyone who's tuned in. We'll see you next time.